Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family. Adele, Tinica, Michelle, Melissa, Mike, Catherine, Sherry, and Rory. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And because you all became subscribers in the month of February, you and everyone else who supports us through Patreon or with a one-time tip through buymeacoffee.com will be entered into this month's special giveaway, the prize for which is an exclusive episode of Boring Books for Bedtime made just for you. You pick the book, and because it's just for you, copyright restrictions do not apply, so almost anything goes. If you're interested in becoming part of that giveaway pool and learning more about the perks available to subscribers, you'll find links to Patreon and buymeacoffee.com in the show description. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue with a book about the practical side of homesteading. 10 Acres Enough, a practical experience showing how a very small farm may be made to keep a very large family, with extensive and profitable experience in the cultivation of the smaller fruits. By Edmund Morris. First published in 1866. By James Miller, 522 Broadway, New York. Let's pick up right where we left off at the beginning of Chapter 10. Let's begin. Chapter 10. Cheated in a cow, a good and a bad one, the saint of the barnyard. Both myself and wife had always coveted a cow. All of the family were extravagantly fond of milk. Where so many children were about, it seemed indispensable to have one. Besides, were we not upon a farm? And what would a farm be without having upon it at least one saint of the barnyard? As soon as we came on the place, I made inquiries of 2 or 3 persons for a cow. The news flew round the neighborhood with amazing rapidity, and in the course of 2 weeks I was besieged with offers. They haunted me in the street as I went daily to the post office, even in the evening as we sat in our parlor. It seemed as if everybody in the township had a cow to sell. Indeed, the annoyance continued long after we had been supplied. Now, though I knew a great deal of milk, having learned to like it the very day I was born, yet I was utterly ignorant of how to choose a cow, and at that time had no friend to advise with. But I suspected that no one who had a first-rate animal would voluntarily part with it, and so expected to be cheated. I hinted as much to my wife, whereupon she begged that the choice might be left to her, to which I partially consented, thinking that if we should be imposed on, I should feel better if the imposition could be made chargeable somewhere else than to my own ignorance. Besides, I knew that she could hardly be worse cheated than myself. One morning, a very respectable-looking old man drove a cow up to the door and called us out to look at her. My wife was pleased with her looks the moment she set eyes on her, while the children were delighted with the calf, some 2 weeks old. I did not like her movements. She seemed restless and ill-tempered, but the old man said that was always the way with cows at their first calving. Still, I should not have bought her, but somehow my wife seemed bewitched in her favor and was determined to have her. This the old man could not fail to notice, and was loud in extolling her good qualities, declaring that she would give 20 quarts of milk a day. After some further parley, he inadvertently admitted that she had never been milked. My wife did not notice this striking discrepancy of a cow giving 20 quarts daily, when as yet no one had ever milked her. But the lie was too bouncing a one to escape my notice. As I saw my wife had set her heart upon the cow, I said nothing, and finally bought cow and calf for $30, though quite certain they could have been had for $5 less, if my wife had not so plainly shown to the old sinner that she was determined to have them. I do not think she will ever be up to me in making a bargain, but as it had been agreed that she should choose a cow, so she was permitted to have her own way. At the end of the week, the calf was sold for $3, a low price. But then my wife wanted the milk, and she and Kate were anxious to begin the milking. I am sure I was quite willing they should have all they could get. When they did begin, there was a great time. Now, most women profess to understand precisely how a cow should be milked, and yet comparatively few know anything about it. They remind me of the Irish girls who are hunting places. These are all first-rate cooks, if you take their word for it, and yet not 1 in 100 knows anything of even the first principles of cooking. The first process in the operation of milking is to fondle with the cow, make her acquaintance, and thus give her to understand that the man or maid with the milking pail approaches her with friendly intentions, in order to relieve her of the usual lacteal secretion. It will never do to approach the animal with combative feelings and intentions. Should the milker be too impetuous, should he swear, speak loud and sharp, scold or kick, or otherwise abuse or frighten the cow, she will probably prove refractory as a mule, and may give the uncouth and unfeeling milker the benefit of her heels, a very pertinent reward to which he, the uncouth milker, is justly entitled, especially in the case of a new milker who may be a perfect stranger to the cow. The utmost kindness and deliberation are necessary. Before commencing to milk, a cow should be fed or have some kind of fodder offered her, in view of diverting her attention from the operation of milking. By this means, the milk is not held up, as the saying is, but is yielded freely. All these precautions are more indispensable when the cow has just been deprived of her calf. She is then uneasy, fretful, and irritable, and generally so disconsolate as to need the kindest treatment and the utmost soothing. The milker should be in close contact with the cow's body, for in this position, if she attempt to kick him, he gets nothing more than a push, whereas if he sits off at a distance, the cow has an opportunity to inflict a severe blow, whenever she feels disposed to do so. All milkers of cow should understand that the udder and teats are highly organized and consequently very sensitive, and these facts should be taken into consideration by amateur milkers, especially when their first essay is made on a young animal after the advent of her first calf, and that one just taken from her. At this period, the hard tugging and squeezing to which many poor dumb brutes have to submit in consequence of the application of hard-fisted, callous, or inexperienced fingers is a barbarity of the very worst kind, for it often converts a docile creature into a vicious one, from which condition it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to wean her. Of every one of these requisites, both wife and daughter were utterly ignorant. They went talking and laughing into the barn, one with a bright tin pail in her hand, an object which the cow had never before seen, and both made at her, forgetting that they were utter strangers to her. Besides, she was thinking of her absent calf and did not want to see anything else. Their appearance and clamor of course frightened her, and as they approached her, so she avoided them. They followed, but she continued to avoid, and once or twice put down her head, shook it menacingly, and even made an incipient lunge at them with her sharply pointed horns. These decided demonstrations of anger frightened them in turn, and they forthwith gave up the pursuit of milk in the face of difficulties so unexpected. We got none that night. In the morning we sent for an experienced milker, but she had the utmost difficulty in getting the cow to stand quiet even for a moment. My wife was quite subdued about the matter. It would never do to keep a cow that nobody could milk. She said but little, however. It was her cow. Longer trial produced no more encouraging result, as she seemed untamable, and my wife was glad to have me sell her for $20, at the same time resolving never again to buy a cow with her first calf. It was voted unanimously that another should be procured, and that this time the choice should be left to me. Now, I never had any idea of buying poor things of any kind, merely because they were cheap. When purchasing or making tools or machinery, I never bought or made any but the very best, as I found that even a good workman could never do a good job with poor tools. So with all my farm implements, I bought the best of their kind that could be had. If my female gardeners had been furnished with heavy and clumsy hoes and rakes, because such were cheap, their mere weight would have disgusted them with the business of hoeing and weeding. So with a cow. It is true, I had become the owner of a magnificent $30 horse, but it was the only beast I could get hold of at the moment when a horse must be had. Besides, he turned out to be like a singed cat, a vast deal better than he looked. I had repeatedly heard of a cow in the neighboring town, which was said to yield so much milk as to be the principal support of a small family, whose head was a hopeless drunkard. She had cost $75, and had been a present to the drunkard's wife from one of her relatives. By careful inquiry, I satisfied myself that this cow gave 20 quarts daily, and that 5 months after calving, and on very indifferent pasture. I went to see her, and then her owner told me she was going to leave the place and would sell the cow for $50. I did not hesitate a moment, but paid the money and had the cow brought home the same evening. My wife and daughter had not the least difficulty in learning to milk her. Under their treatment and my improved feeding, we kept her in full flow for a long time. She gave quite as much milk as 2 ordinary cows, while we had the expense of keeping only 1. This I consider genuine good management. The best is always the cheapest. The cow was never permitted to go out of the barnyard. A trough of water enabled her to drink as often as she needed, but her green food was brought to her regularly 3 times daily, with double allowance at night. I began by mowing all the little grass plots about the house and lanes, for in these sheltered nooks the sod sends up a heavy growth far in advance of field or meadow. But this supply was soon exhausted, though it lasted more than a week. Besides, these usually neglected nooks afforded several mowings during the season, and the repeated cuttings produced the additional advantage of maintaining the sod in beautiful condition, as well as getting rid of numberless weeds. When the grass had all been once mowed over, we resorted to the clover. This also was mowed and taken to her, and by this treatment my little clover field held out astonishingly. Long before I had gone over it once, the portion first mowed was up high enough to be mowed again. Indeed, we did secure some hay in addition. In this way both horse and cow were soiled. When the clover gave out, the green corn, which I had sowed in rows, was 18 inches to 2 feet high, and in capital condition to cut and feed. It then took the place of clover. Both horse and cow devoured it with high relish. It was the extra sweet corn, now so extensively cultivated in New Jersey for market, and contained an excess of saccharine matter, which made it not only very palatable, but which sensibly stimulated the flow of milk. The yield of green food which this description of corn gives to the acre when thus sowed is enormous. Not having weighed it, I cannot speak as to the exact quantity, but should judge it to be at least 7 times that of the best grass or clover. Even without cutting up with a straw knife, the pigs ate it with equal avidity. In addition to this, the cow was fed morning and night with a little bran. The unconsumed corn, after being dried where it grew, was cut and gathered for winter fodder, and when cut fine and mixed with turnips which had been passed through a slicer, kept the cow in excellent condition. She of course got many an armful of cabbage leaves during the autumn and all through the winter, with now and then a sprinkling of sliced pumpkins, from which the seeds had first been taken, as they are sure to diminish the flow of milk. Thus I was obliged to lay out no money for either horse or cow, except the few dollars expended for bran. By this treatment I secured all the manure they made. By feeding the barnyard itself, as well as the hog pen, with green weeds and whatever litter and trash could be gathered up, the end of the season found me with a huge manure pile, all nicely collected under a rough shed, out of reach of drenching rain, hot sun, and wasting winds. I certainly secured thrice as much in one season as had ever been made on that place in 3. In addition to this, the family had had more milk than they could use, fresh, rich, and buttery. Even the pigs fell heir to an occasional bucket of skim milk. When our city friends came to spend a day or 2 with us, we were able to astonish them with a tumbler of thick cream instead of the usual staple beverages of the tea table. My wife evidently felt a sort of pride in making a display of this kind, and Kate invariably spread herself by taking our visitors to the barnyard to let them see how expert she had become at milking. When they remarked at table on the surpassing richness of the cream as well as the milk, my wife was very apt to reply, "Yes, but when your turn comes to go in the country, be particular not to buy a cheap cow." This remark generally led to inquiry, and then Kate was brought out with the whole story of our first and second cow, which she accordingly gave with illustrations infinitely more amusing than any I have been able to introduce. Indeed, her power of amplification sometimes astonished me. She told the story of our having been cheated by the old sinner with such graphic liveliness, my wife now and then interposing a parenthesis, that the company invariably concluded it was by far the better policy to give a wide berth to cheap cows. I am not certain whether the fun occasioned by Kate's narratives was not really very cheaply purchased by the small loss we suffered on that occasion. This abundance of milk wrought quite a change in our habits as to tea and coffee. At supper during the summer, we drank milk only, but insensibly we ran on in the same way into cold weather. In the end, we found that we liked coffee in the morning only. This was a clear saving, besides being quite as wholesome. Our city milk bill had usually been $1 a week. I am quite sure it did not cost over 60 cents a week to keep the cow. Then we had puddings and other dishes, which milk alone makes palatable whenever we wanted them. And at any time of a hot summer's day, a full draught of cold milk was always within reach. Then the quality was much superior, exceeding anything to be found in city milk. I must admit that keeping a cow, like most other good things, involves some trouble. But my family would cheerfully undertake twice as much as they ever had with ours, rather than dispense with this yet uncanonized saint of the barnyard. Chapter 11. A Cloud of Weeds. Great Sales of Plants. June came without my being obliged to hire anything but occasional help on the farm. But when the month was fairly set in, I found every inch of my plowed land in a fair way of being smothered by the weeds. I was amazed at the countless numbers which sprang up, as well as with the rapidity with which they grew. There was almost every variety of these pests. It seemed as if the whole township had concentrated its wealth of weeds upon my premises. In the quick, warm soil of New Jersey, they appear to have found a most congenial home, as they abound on every farm that I have seen. Cultivators appear to have abandoned all hope of eradicating them. Knowing that the last year's crop had gone to seed, I confessed on looking for something of the kind, but I was wholly unprepared for the thick haze which everywhere covered the ground. I can bear any quantity of snakes, but for weeds I have a sort of religious aversion. I tried one week to overcome them with the cultivator, but I made discouraging headway. I then bought a regular horse weeder, which cut them down rapidly and effectually. But meantime, others were growing up in the rows and corners and by-places where nothing but the hoe could reach them, and robbing the crops of their support. It would never do to cultivate weeds. They must be got rid of at any cost, or my crops would be worthless. Several neighboring farmers, who had doubtless counted on this state of things, came along about the time they supposed my hands would be full, looked over the fence at my courageous onslaught, laughed, and called out, "It's no use, you can't kill the weeds." Such was the sympathy they afforded. If my house had been on fire, every one of them would have promptly hurried to the rescue, but to assist a man in killing his weeds was what no one dreamed of doing. He didn't kill his own. In this dilemma, I was forced to hire a young man to help me, contracting to give him $12 a month and board him. He turned out sober and industrious. We went to work courageously on the weeds. I will admit that my man Dick was quite as certain as my neighbors that we could never get permanently ahead of them, and that thus lacking faith, he took hold of the cultivator and weeder, while I attacked the enemy in the rows and by-places. I kept him constantly at it and worked steadily myself. A week's labor left a most encouraging mark upon the ground. The hot sun wilted and dried up the weeds as we cut them off. 2 weeks enabled us to get over the whole lot, making it look clean and nice. I congratulated myself on our success, and inquired of Dick if he didn't think we had got ahead of the enemy now. This was on a Saturday evening. Dick looked up at the sky, which was then black and showery, with a warm south wind blowing, and a broad laugh came over his features as he replied, "This will do till next time." The fellow was evidently unwilling either to encourage or to disappoint me. That night, a powerful rain fell, with a warm, sultry wind, being what farmers call growing weather. I found it to be even so, good for weeds at least. Monday morning came with a hot, clear sun, and under the combined stimulating power of sun, rain, and temperature, I found that in 2 nights a new generation had started into life, quite as numerous as that we had just overcome. As I walked over the ground in company with Dick, I was confounded at the sight, but I noticed that he expressed no astonishment whatever. It was just what he knew was to come. And so he declared it would be if we made the ground as clean as a parlor every week. He said he never knew the weeds to be got out of Jersey ground, and protested that it couldn't be done. He admitted that they were nuisances, but so were mosquitoes. But as neither in his opinion did any great harm, so he thought it not worth while to spend much time or money in endeavoring to get rid of them. In either case he considered the attempt a vain one, and this was the whole extent of his philosophy. He had in fact been educated to believe in weeds. I was mortified at his indifference, for I had labored to infuse into his mind the same hatred of the tribe with which my wife and Kate had been so happily inoculated. But Dick was proof against inoculation. His system repudiated it. As to defining what a weed was, I did not undertake that, beyond pronouncing it to be a plant growing out of its proper place. Neither did I undertake to settle the question as to the endless variety there seemed to be of these pests, nor by what unaccountable agency they had become so thoroughly diffused over the earth. I could not fail to admit, however, that it seemed in the providence of God that whenever man ceased to till the ground and cover it with cultivated crops, at his almighty command there sprung up a profuse vegetation with which to clothe its nakedness. While man might be idle, it was impossible for nature to be so. The earth could not lie barren of everything. But it seemed to me impossible that these 10 acres of mine could contain an absolutely indefinite number of seeds of these unwelcome plants. There must be some limitation of the number. At what figure did it stop? Was it 1,000,000 or 100 millions? Neither Dick nor myself could answer this question. Yet I came resolutely to the conclusion that there must be a limitation, and that if we could induce all the seeds contained in the soil to vegetate, and then destroy the plants before they matured a new crop, we should ever afterwards be excused from such constant labor as we had gone through, and as was likely to be our experience in the future. I submitted this proposition to Dick, that if we killed all the weeds as they grew, the time would come when there would be no weeds to kill. It struck me as being so simple that even Dick, with all his doggedness, could neither fail to comprehend nor acknowledge it. He did manage to comprehend it, but as to acknowledging its force, one might have argued with him for a month. He utterly denied the premises. He had no faith in our Jersey weeds ever being killed, no matter how much luck we had thus far had with them, and I would see that he was right. But having originated the dogma, I fully believed in it, and felt bound to maintain it. So Dick and I went resolutely to work a second time, as soon as the new crop was well out of the ground. The labor was certainly not as great as on the first crop, but it was hot work. I carried a file in my pocket, and kept my hoe as sharp as I have always kept my carving knife, and taught Dick to put his horse weeder in prime order every evening when we had quit work. The perspiration ran in a stream from me in the hot sun, and a few blisters rose on my hands. But my appetite was rampant, and never have my slumbers been so undisturbed and peaceful. About the 3rd week in June, we got through the second cleaning, and then rested. From that time to the end of the 1st week in July, there had been no rain, with a powerfully hot sun. During this interval the weeds grew again, and entirely new generations, some few of the first varieties, but the remainder being new sorts. Thus there were wet weather weeds and dry weather weeds, and as I afterwards found, there was a regular succession of varieties from spring to winter, and even into December. Cold weather weeds, as well as hot weather weeds. Against each new army as it showed itself, an onslaught was to be made. I was persuaded in my mind that the same army which we killed this year could not show itself the next, and that therefore there ought to be that number less, but Dick could not see this. I observed, moreover, that each variety had its particular period when it vegetated, so that it might have time to get ahead and keep out of the way of its successor. It was evident that the seeds of any one kind did not all vegetate the same season. Herein was a wonderful provision of Providence to ensure the perpetuity of all. For if all the ragweed, for instance, had vegetated the first season of my experience, they would assuredly have been killed. But multitudes remained dormant in the earth, as if thus stored up for the purpose of repairing another year the casualties which their forerunners had encountered during the present one. Thus, no one weed can be extirpated in a single season. Neither do we have the whole catalog to attack at the same time. My warfare against the enemy continued unabated. As the time came for each new variety to show itself, so we took it in hand with hoe and weeder. Dick and his horse made such admirable progress that I cannot refrain from recommending this most efficient tool to the notice of every cultivator. With one man and a horse, it will do the work of 6 men, cutting off the weeds just below the ground and leaving them to wilt on the surface. It costs but $6 and can be had in all the cities. It would have cost me $100 to do the same amount of work with the hoe, which this implement did within 4 weeks. Thus aided, our labors extended clear into November. In the intervals between the different growths of weeds, we looked after the other crops. But when the winter closed in upon us, the whole ground was so thoroughly cleaned of them as to be the admiration of the jeerers and croakers, who early in the season had pitied my enthusiasm or ridiculed my anticipations. Even Dick was somewhat subdued and doubtful. I do not think a single weed escaped our notice and went to seed that season. I saw this year a beautiful illustration of the idea that there are specific manures for certain plants. I can hardly doubt that each has its specific favorite, and that if cultivators could discover what that favorite is, our crops might be indefinitely increased. On a piece of ground which had been sowed with turnips, on which guano had previously been sprinkled during a gentle rain, there sprang up the most marvelous growth of purslane that ever met one's eyes. The whole ground was covered with the rankest growth of this weed that could be imagined. Every turnip was smothered out. It seemed as if the dormant purslane seed had been instantly called into life by the touch of the guano. It was singular, too, that we had noticed no purslane growing on that particular spot previous to the application of this rapidly acting fertilizer. I confess the sight of a dense carpet of purslane instead of a crop of turnips almost staggered me as to the correctness of my theory that the number of seeds in the ground yet to vegetate must somewhere have a limit. Here were evidently millions of a kind, which up to this time had not even showed themselves. After allowing the purslane to grow 2 weeks, Dick cut it off with his horse weeder, raked it up, and carried it to the pigs, who consumed it with avidity. We then recultivated the ground and sowed again with turnips, but the yield was very poor. Either the purslane had appropriated the whole energy of the guano, or the sowing was too late in the season. But this little incident will illustrate the value of observation to a farmer. Book farming is a good thing in its place, but observation is equally instructive. The former is not sufficient of itself to make good tillers of the soil. It will not answer in place of attentive observation. It forms indeed but the poorest kind of a substitute for that habit which every farmer should cultivate, of going all over his premises daily during the growing season and noticing the peculiarities of particular plants, the habits of destructive animals or insects, the depredations as well as the services of birds, the when, the how, and the apparent wherefore of the germination of seeds, the growth of the stem, the vine, or the stalk that proceeds from them, and the formation, growth, and ripening of the fruit which they bear. let no farmer, fruit grower, or gardener neglect observation for an exclusive reliance on book farming. It would be a most erroneous conclusion for the reader to suppose that all this long continued labor in keeping the ground clear of weeds was so much labor thrown away. On the contrary, even apart from ridding the soil of so many nuisances, so many robbers of the nourishment provided for useful plants, it kept the land in the most admirable condition. The good conferred upon the garden by hoeing and raking was reenacted here. Everything I had planted grew with surprising luxuriance. I do think it was an illustration of the value of thorough culture, made so manifest that no one could fail to observe it. It abundantly repaid me for all my watchfulness and care. Dick was forced to acknowledge that he had seen no such clean work done in that part of New Jersey. My nurseryman came along at the end of the season to see how I had fared, and walked deliberately over the ground with me, examining the peach trees. He said he had never seen young trees grow more vigorously. Not one of them had died. The raspberries had not grown so much as he expected, but the strawberry rows were now filled with plants. As runners were thrown out, I had carefully trained them in line with the parent stools, not permitting them to sprawl right and left over a great surface, forming a mass that could not be weeded even by hand. This he did not approve of. He said by letting them spread out right and left, the crop of fruit would be much greater, but admitted that the size of the berries would be much smaller. But he contended that quantity was what the public wanted, and that they did not care so much for quality. Yet he could not explain the damaging fact that the largest sized fruit was always the most eagerly sought after, and invariably commanded the highest price. Though he did not approve of my mode of cultivation, yet he could not convince me that I had made a mistake. From these we walked over to the blackberries. They too had grown finely under my thorough culture of the ground. Besides sending up good canes, which promised a fair crop the next season, each root had sent up several suckers, some of them several feet away and out of the line of the row. These I had intended to sell, and had preserved as many as possible, knowing there would be a demand for all. The interest in the new berry had rapidly extended all round among my neighbors, and I very soon discovered that my nurseryman wanted to buy. In fact, I believe he came more for that purpose than to see how I was doing. But I talked offish, spoke of having engaged 2 or 3 lots, and could hardly speak with certainty. Finally, he offered to give me a receipt for the $120 he was to receive out of the strawberries he had sold me, and pay me $100 down for 1,000 blackberry plants. Though I felt pretty sure I could do better, yet I closed with him. As he had evidently come prepared with money to clinch some sort of bargain, he produced it and paid me on the spot. He afterwards retailed nearly all of the plants for a much larger sum. But it was a good bargain for both of us. It paid me well, and was all clear profit. I may add that these blackberry roots came into more active demand from that time until the next spring. And when spring opened, more suckers came up, as if knowing they were wanted. These with my previous stock amounted to a large number. A seed man in the city advertised them for sale and took retail orders for me. His sales with my own absorbed every root I could spare. When they had all been disposed of and my receipts were footed up, I found that they amounted to $460, leaving me $340 clear after paying for my strawberry plants. This was far better than I had anticipated. It may sound curiously now, when the plants can be had so cheaply, but it is a true picture of the market at the time of which I write. It is the great profit to be realized from the sale of new plants that stimulates their cultivation. Many men have made fortunes from the sale of a new fruit or flower, and others are repeating the operation now. In fact, it is the hope of this great gain that has given to the world so many new and valuable plants, some originated from seed, some by hybridization, some from solitary hiding places in the woods and mountains, and some by importation from distant countries. Success in one thing stimulates to exertion for another, and thus the race of a vast and intelligent competition is maintained. But the public is the greatest gainer after all. My profits from this source the first year may by some be regarded as an exceptional thing, to be realized only by the fortunate few, and not to be regularly counted on. But this is not the case. There are thousands of cultivators who are constantly in the market as purchasers. If it were not so, the vast nursery establishments which exist all over the country could not be maintained. Every fruit grower like myself has been compelled to buy in the beginning of his operations, but his turn for selling has invariably come round. As a general rule, whatever outlay a beginner makes in supplying himself with the smaller fruits is afterwards reimbursed from the sale of surplus plants he does not need. This sale occurs annually, and in time will far exceed his original outlay. If the plants be rare in the market, and if he should have gone into the propagation at a very early day, before prices have found their lowest level, his profits will be the larger. Hence the utmost watchfulness of the market should be maintained. New plants, better breeds of animals, and in fact, every improvement connected with agriculture, if judiciously adopted at the earliest moment, will generally be found to pay, even after allowing for losses on the numerous cheats which are continually turning up. And with that good advice and the conclusion of Chapter 11, I think we'll end this evening's reading from 10 Acres Enough. I know more than a few of us have thought about lighting out and setting up on a homestead of our own, so I really appreciate the very practical advice in this book. It's definitely not as easy as YouTube makes it look. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.